Hi, welcome to the sort of foundation course, as it were, on Matthew 24. In terms of digging a foundation, you have to build your house on the rock. And to do that, you need to dig down and get through to the solid ground so that you can build your foundation. And many people are not willing to do that. They just want to start with somebody else's finished product. They start with a chart, they start with somebody else's plan, they let somebody else do all the groundwork, and it's like moving in a prefab house or a chalet or something. The thing is that actually you need to do it all yourself so that you know the certainty of what you believe. And going back to those basics is something which is lacking in the theology of many people. I like to go through things right from the basics and do all the groundwork myself. And first of all, let's just look at the evidence. We're not saying, oh, this is this or this is that. We're just looking at the evidence, and we will let that draw us and lead us to its own conclusion. Okay, here's the Olivet Discourse, and first of all, there's this question: what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age? And Jesus then gives a series of things which will happen before finally answering the question in verse 30, where then he says, "Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear." So we have a series of different elements in this sequence. We've got wars, famines, pestilences, and other things. Then he says there will be tribulation, there will be false prophets, the abomination of desolation, that's something to do with Daniel, and he describes that as great tribulation. And then after the tribulation, then the sun and the moon will change, and that's when the sign of the Son of Man will appear. And it says that then he will gather his elect from the four winds, from heaven, and indeed, according to Mark, earth as well. And then there are some parables which give us a proper understanding of how to understand what Jesus has said in the earlier verses. And there are some warnings about judgment. He says that the flood came and took them all away. And so there's this command at the end to watch. And then it goes into Matthew 25, which is also part of the same speech. Don't separate them. But the parables there give us a proper, clear understanding of the right attitude that we should have towards these things. And so therefore, we've got this first stage here, which is about wars, famines, and pestilences. And that's interesting because those are the agents, sword, famine, and plague, of wrath in the Old Testament. So these are things which are happening to the world, because wrath by definition is something that happens to the ungodly. It's something that God sends against the ungodly, not against Christians. We're not appointed to wrath, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is what happens to the world, but it's something for us to look out for, because Jesus gave them as a sign that we should look out for it. Then there's this section here, which is all about tribulation and persecution. Tribulation is something that Christians suffer. You suffer for your faith in Jesus. And so here we have a section which is for believers during this time. This is what we should expect. Okay, it's quite separate from the first section, which has a totally different nature, and we'll talk about that later. Then after the tribulation, we finally get the answer to our question, what is the sign of your coming? And here we have the coming of Jesus, and with great power and glory, and he sends out his angels to gather the elect. So there we have the fulfillment of the age. And then finally we have these warnings and these parables which are there to give us a proper understanding and also to bring in judgment. All right. Then. First of all, however, we're going to look at the question. All right. We need to see exactly what is being asked. Now, here's a question. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age?" Okay, so first of all, the question is, what is a sign? Not signs, just one sign, and that's answered in verse 30. However, Jesus also gives us supporting contextual signs, and so, all of these are signs which lead to his coming, but specifically, the question is for one. Okay, and also it's his coming. The word there is parousia. That becomes significant later on. I'm not going to explain much about that, but here we have the word parousia, and of the end of the age. Okay, now it's very important to realize that, of course, these signs must come before the parousia and the end of the age. Otherwise, there's no point in having the signs. So we're talking about a sequence, and then we're expecting to see the parousia and the end of the age after these signs at the end of this sequence. Okay, so let's look on, because it says specifically that the end is not yet, and indeed then the end will come. Okay, so there's this emphasis that these things must happen before the end, before the fulfillment. The word there actually is telos. Okay, and Jesus actually underlines that, really, because he says this is the beginnings of sorrows. Okay, this is just the beginning. This is just the start. Okay, so one of the things I object to is the boxes that people put things into. Sometimes you may have looked at this and said immediately, oh, that's a 7-year tribulation. Actually, where does it say 7 years? Okay, it might do in other scriptures, but here, just looking at the evidence, just working it out step by step by step, following the instructions, we haven't had a timescale given at all. Okay, so we're not going to say it's on a certain timescale, a certain number of years. Also, he hasn't said that this whole thing is called the tribulation. Okay, so don't put it into that box. As soon as you have a box and you start force-feeding or fitting your things into that box, then you will make things bend to fit. Let's just keep it open, and let's just see that there are some events that Jesus is talking about at some time in the future, and we need to learn what they are. Okay. The other box that people put this in often is, oh, that's for the Jews, and they don't even read this. So there's even some teachers who say, I don't teach Matthew 24 because it's not for Christians. Where has Jesus said that this is for the Jews? Where has he said, right, I'm now addressing the nation of Israel, or anything that even implies that? Okay. And we need to look at this question, because many Christians are not studying this because they don't think it's for them. And I'd like to address that, especially if you are one of those who feels that way. I'd like you to really examine that. Now, if it's true, then it will withstand examination, won't it? But if it's not, then let's see it for what it says. All right. Now, I've had people say this to me in the past. And in fact, I've based this particular section on a real conversation. I've had very large numbers of conversations like this, but this particular conversation, I remember somebody came up and said, he was gushing, he said, we had this wonderful teaching, somebody came and taught us about Matthew 24 and how it's for the Jews. And I said, how have they worked that out? And they said, Jesus was at Jerusalem at the temple, so he was addressing the Jewish nation. Now, it may be the case that you're listening and you don't believe that, you haven't said that, that's fine, it doesn't apply, but I'm just talking about this particular case where Jesus was at Jerusalem in the temple and he was addressing the Jewish nation. I thought, that's interesting. And by this time, of course, we had the Bibles open, and I read Matthew 24 verse 1. I said, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple. So he was not at the temple, was he? Okay, so if that's the basis of your interpretation, then you have to check that and say, no, he's not. Okay. But of course, the answer came, he was near the temple, he was certainly around Jerusalem, and he could see the temple. Okay, fine. And he was addressing the Jews there. I said, really, was he? I said, because verse 3 says that now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Okay, so he was not talking to the Jews, he was talking to the disciples. The response was, well, the disciples as Jews represent their nation. Really? Okay, that's good. That's interesting. Okay, so what you're saying is that Jesus speaking privately to the disciples means that what he says is for the Jews, for the Jewish nation, for Israel, perhaps. Okay, fine. You believe that? Okay. The thing is, you have to be consistent. That means that you apply the same principle in the same situation. You can't just chop and change. Okay, so every text where you have the same criteria, Jesus speaking privately to the disciples, then it has to be treated the same. So every time Jesus spoke to the disciples privately, then that meant it was for Israel. Can you think of any other scriptures where Jesus was speaking privately to the disciples? Big chunks of the Gospels fit that criteria. So, for example, who was at the Last Supper? Well, Jesus and the disciples. Anyone else? We don't know. But that would mean that communion is only for Jews, because that's where Jesus taught the communion. So Jews should practice communion, but not Christians. Interesting. Okay, and the plot gets thicker. You could start asking about John 14. I mean, everything from John 13 to John 17 is at the Last Supper, and it was at that point that Jesus spoke about the Holy Spirit, and he promised the Comforter. So that's not for Christians either, that's for the Jews. Oh, and what about John 14? Doesn't that include the promise of the rapture? I come back and take you to be with me. If that's about the rapture, well, it was Jesus speaking privately to the disciples, and that means that the rapture is not for us, it's for the Jews. So Jesus, when he comes back, is going to take the Jews and he's going to leave us. Right. Okay. The whole thing just gets in a mess, doesn't it? And it's really time to rethink. You really have to see these things. You have to scratch the surface. You have to push and test all things and hold on to what's good. Where does Jesus say that Matthew 24 is for the Jews? He doesn't. The next comment is that Matthew is a gospel for the Jews, and so therefore Matthew 24 is addressed to the Jews. Well, it certainly is very Jewish in its character, but who are the other gospels for? And they'd say usually Luke is for the Gentiles or something like that, and so on. Well, the thing is that the same teaching that's in Matthew 24 is also in Luke. So how can the same teaching in Matthew and Luke, one be for the Jews and one for the Gentiles? Actually, of course, they're all for believers. That's why Luke 21, for example, says, when you see these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. Okay, these events have to happen, and then the redemption is at the end of that sequence of events. And we see that very much in Matthew 24. It's addressed to believers. When you see, they will deliver you up. They will kill you. It's all addressed to you. Watch that nobody deceives you. Okay, so it's addressed to believers. It's not addressed to Israel. All right, it was addressed to the disciples. And we need to come to terms with that and realize, look, Matthew 24 is for me. Matthew 24 is for believers. Okay, and when you can really grasp that, then you can really start to look into that scripture and really see how rich it is and how much there is for you. Okay, so now let's move on to the first section, and we'll do that in the next teaching. Bless you.